White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki brushed off concerns about liberal cities' soft on crime policies in her recent appearance on the left-leaning Pod Save America podcast. She joked that media coverage of violence in major cities like New York came from, quote, an alternate universe. The coverage she was specifically referencing in the interview was Fox reporting that was on her television at the time. The national president of the Fraternal Order of Police reacted to Psaki's comments on Monday, calling her remarks, quote, very wrong. Here to discuss is co-host of the Outlaws radio show and CEO of FCB Radio Network, Darvio Morrow. Welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, Darvio, what did you think about Psaki's comments? Is that a fair reflection of the situation we see out there?
Not at all. I thought it was absolutely ridiculous. It's like if the American people believe that they're out of touch with reality and with what everyday people are dealing with. So I would think that you would try to show that you feel their pain. But of course, they didn't do that because, like my grandmother used to say, that sounds too much like right. So they went to the opposite direction. Obviously, the crime situation is real. Everybody's dealing with it across the country. Here in Cleveland, where I'm at, from New Year's Eve to New Year's Day in a 20-hour span, there were 10 people shot. We're dealing with a bunch of carjackings. Earlier this year, at the beginning of the year, a police officer, Shane Bartek, was shot and killed in the middle of an attempted carjacking. Last year in 2021 was the second highest homicide rate in 30 years. So I don't understand how it could be this bad at the time. I just don't get it. And I don't know who's advising her. She might as well have said, let them be. I don't.
Yeah, it used to be the case, I think, throughout the aughts, when crime was, late 90s, early aughts, crime was down, and I would feel like the media was making things sound like it's worse than, focusing on a handful of kidnappings or crimes, but actually crime was down, and it was great. But we have seen crime tick back up. It's terrible in our big cities, elsewhere. Part of it's the pandemic, but it was starting before the pandemic. We're kind of trying to figure out what the causes are. It's hard to understand. But now you have this kind of blanket denial or acknowledgement or downplaying in a lot of it, both from the government and I think from a lot of mainstream media figures that right just doesn't make sense because it doesn't match with it doesn't match with what people are experiencing, right? It's like they won't trust you because they know that things are worse than are being acknowledged.
Absolutely. I mean, a couple of weeks ago, right around the corner from my studio where I'm sitting talking to you right now, someone was carjacked and shot. So I mean, it's real out here. And I don't understand why they think that pretending that these things aren't happening is the best way to deal with the situation. I don't understand who's advising them because we can see. We know what's going on in our everyday lives. We know what's going on in our cities. And if they decide that this is the track that they want to keep going on, then in November they deserve to lose. They deserve to get the brakes beat off of them at the ballot box.
I've seen some folks try to connect the rise in shootings and the rise in murders to criminal justice reform and police reform. But then if you look closer, in cities and states where there hasn't been any reform, you also see a similar uptick in shootings and murders. And so, like you said, something's going on out there. What is your sense? I mean, on the one hand, over the last 10 years, the number of guns that just are in people's possessions has, doubled or tripled. There's an extraordinarily, we're much more armed than when we were even 10 or 15 years ago when we were armed to the teeth. But what is your sense of what it is that's driving this?
So I think it's a combination of things. I have seen some doctors and sociologists talk about the possibility that all of the social isolation as a result of the pandemic has contributed. I believe that there's some truth to that. I also do believe that even in the cities where there hasn't necessarily been laws changed, there's an overall climate where people think that they can get away with whatever they want to. And I think that contributes as well. And then when you add, of course, there's always socioeconomic factors when it comes to crime as well. That's always a part of it also. So I think it's a number of things, a number of bad things kind of coming together at the same time.
Darvio, in the press conference, Jen Psaki clarified and said that, well, the administration is not actually soft on crime. In fact, the administration is ramping up and giving a lot of money to police programs across the country. In fact, she said it was more than the previous administration, that they're going to be investing in policing. And following on that, I mean, because there are many factors that are potentially leading to this rise in crime, and it's not about the defund the police movement. And Jen Psaki brought that up, saying that President Biden has never been for defund the police, and he's actually ramping up police funding. What is going to be the solution to this? I mean, to me, it doesn't seem like more policing is necessarily going to be what solves the crime rate issue. What do you think it's going to be? What is it going to take?
So I think it's a number of factors. So, for example, here in Cleveland, we are down. Our police department is down over 200 officers. And we were already lower than we needed to be prior to that. So I do think that there is a part of it where you do need more officers. But I also agree that alone doesn't solve the problem. But the issue that we have here now is that when you have an uptick in crime like this, no one wants to have a conversation about the underlying factors, right? Like, you have to stop the literal and figurative bleeding first before you can start to address, socioeconomic issues and things like that. And that becomes the problem here. When we can't have this conversation about, addressing, the social issues, the economic issues and things like that in the middle of a war zone. Like, you got to stop bleeding first and then try to address the underlying.
Well, I think nobody.
I just don't. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I just don't know if criminals actually are sitting there, doing a tally of how many cops are on duty today, and then saying, well, it looks like they're down a few officers, so now's my time.
No,
I mean, I don't. That's.
Well, they noticed there's fewer of them on the streets, right?
I get what you're saying, but when you have less cops on the street, it makes it like criminals are. Not all of them are stupid, right? Like, they understand when I did this and I was able to get away with it, then I'll do some more things. We have a big issue here where a lot of the people who have went on to commit violent crimes have long rap sheets where they've been doing stuff over and over and over again and getting away with it. And each time they get more emboldened. So you have to take a two-pronged approach. You need both.
Yeah, it goes back to that statistical reality that something like, the numbers fluctuate, but something like 90% of crimes are committed by like 10% of people. Is that what you're seeing in Cleveland? That it's kind of the same people over and over?
Yeah, basically. I mean, that's exactly what we're seeing here. And we have a situation where, like I mentioned earlier about Shane Bartek, the police officer who was shot and killed at the beginning of January. The young lady that shot and killed him, she was 18 years old. She already had a rap sheet a mile long. And there were, she had committed different crimes in different counties, and they were fighting over jurisdiction and all kinds of bureaucratic BS that allowed this person who had been accused of violent crimes. We're not talking about petty things. We're talking about armed robberies and things like that. She'd been accused of violent crimes, and she was able to be on the street, and she ended up shooting and killing a police officer.
Well, you're right. A lot. Talking about crime statistics, so much of crime is committed between people, by people, usually men, actually, but by between the ages of 16 and 30. There's a lot of teenagers committing crime, and maybe they start out with less serious crime before they get into the very serious stuff. We just went through a 2-year period where we closed social services, closed churches, closed schools, closed community outreach things. And so then you have, and the people in government did that, had to do it because of the pandemic, so they say. And now we have crumbling social trust and broken communities, and of course our a restless kind of at-risk population, the kind of people on the border who are more vulnerable to falling into this kind of behavior. Well, of course, more of them are falling into this behavior, but they don't want to admit that this strategy was short-sighted or that it was going to have this consequence.
No doubt. I mean, we had an issue here for example, where when the public school district first went to online learning in the pandemic, well, I had around 45 to 50% of the residents of the city of Cleveland don't have access to reliable internet. So how the hell are they supposed to be able, how are these kids supposed to be able to do their work in an online environment when half of the city doesn't have access to reliable internet? And what ended up happening as well is a lot of the inner city youth, they were going to school as a way to get away from their everyday life and the environment in which they live. So when you don't have that anymore, all of those elements, like, you have no escape. There's no way to get around it. So yes, absolutely. I'm in complete agreement with that these things, and we're not having enough of a conversation, a large enough of a conversation about that. This has exacerbated a lot of the issues that we're seeing in the inner city in particular.
Yeah. And the solution that was applied in the 80s and 90s, mass incarceration, is now kind of having a reverberating effect, because you have all these people who, like you said, these long rap sheets, who then spent 10, 15 years behind bars picking up all of these new skills and coming out trained in crime. May have gone in for petty crime, but now are coming out after spending 10 or 15 years in a violent environment and now thrown back out onto the street. Are you seeing some of that too? So that whereas the old solution is actually now creating some of the problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a couple of years ago, my mom works in the nonprofit sector and has worked in the nonprofit world for like 20-something years. And a friend of hers who was still living at the time, she worked in reentry. And this was, a couple of years ago, and kept trying to warn city officials, trying to warn, people in the county and people in the state, like, look, there's about to be a wave of people coming back home from prison who had 10, 15, 20-year sentences. And we need to be able to do something to help these folks, because if not, it's going to be a big problem in the streets. And what ended up happening, we ended up starting to see just that population that everybody locked up in the 80s and 90s, as they started to come home, there was no robust reentry programs, anything really to help them reacclimate into society. So it ended up happening what happened.
Yeah. Darvio, thank you so much for sharing that perspective with us.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate all of you.
Thank you. We'll be back in just a minute with more Rising. Stay with us.